Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, I want you to just settle in, dim the lights, pull up that heavy blanket, and maybe find a spot where the draft from the window can't quite reach you. Because tonight, we're heading somewhere cold, somewhere genuinely bone-chillingly freezing. We're talking about the Vikings, but not the raiding, shouting, axe-swinging version you see in the movies. No, we're looking at the Vikings who were just trying to survive a Tuesday in February in the middle of the Arctic Circle without a single central heating unit to their name. It's a story of damp wool, questionable hygiene, and the kind of architectural choices that make you realize just how much we take for granted today. So, take a deep breath, relax, and let's float over to the icy, smoky world of the Norse Longhouse. Now, when we think of home, we usually think of separate rooms. You've got a kitchen, a bedroom, maybe a bathroom if you're living the high life. But for the Vikings, the concept of personal space was basically non-existent. Their solution to the Arctic winter was the longhouse, which was essentially a giant upturned boat made of wood and sod. And when I say sod, I mean blocks of turf. They literally lived inside a hill. It was great for insulation, sure, but it also meant your house was constantly trying to grow grass on the outside while slowly rotting on the inside. Because why wouldn't you want to live in a damp, earthy burrito for 6 months of the year? At the center of this earthy burrito was the hearth. Now, you'd think fireplace, but that's far too modern. This was just a long, open stone pit in the middle of the floor. There was no chimney, let that sink in. There was just a hole in the roof, which they called a wind eye, or vindauga, where we get our word window from. The problem with a hole in the roof is that smoke is lazy. It doesn't just zoom out the hole, it lingers, it swirls, it coats everything in a fine layer of soot. So if you were a Viking, you weren't just cold, you were also slightly smoked, like a piece of artisanal salmon, but with significantly more back pain. Let's talk about the seating arrangements, because they were delightfully awkward. Everyone sat on raised wooden platforms that lined the walls. You ate there, you worked there, and you slept there. And because the fire was in the middle, the person closest to the hearth was basically being slow cooked, while the person against the wall was slowly turning into an icicle. It was a constant game of thermal musical chairs. And because these longhouses were often shared with livestock, yes, the cows lived inside too, the smell was, well, let's call it complex. You had peat smoke, wet wool, unwashed warriors, and a confused goat all competing for your nostrils' attention. But hey, a cow produces about 400 watts of body heat. In the Arctic, a stinky cow is just a biological space heater that occasionally moves. The Vikings were also obsessed with wool. If you weren't wearing wool, you were probably dead. They had these vodmal cloaks that were so thick they were practically waterproof. But imagine the smell of wet, oily sheep wool drying over a smoky peat fire. It's the kind of scent that stays with you, not just in your clothes, but in your soul. They also didn't really have beds in the way we do. They had shut beds, which were basically wooden cupboards you crawled into and closed the door. It sounds cozy until you realize you're locking yourself into a dark wooden box with your own breath and whatever spiders decided to move in that day. It was essentially a coffin you used every night to stay warm. Of course, the elite had it slightly better, but only slightly. A king might have a fancier tapestry on his wall to stop the drafts, but at the end of the day, he was still breathing in the same soot as the guy cleaning the stables. There's a certain grim irony in being a great sea king and yet spending your entire winter hunched over a pile of burning moss trying to keep your toes from falling off. They spent a lot of time waiting for the sun to come back, waiting for the ice to melt, waiting for someone to invent a chimney. Let's float over to their diet for a second. You couldn't exactly nip out for groceries when there's 6 feet of snow outside. Everything was preserved. Dried fish that had the texture of a leather boot, fermented shark that smelled like a cleaning product, and lots of porridge. It was a very beige existence. They also drank a lot of ale and mead, not just because they liked to party, but because the water was often questionable, and the alcohol provided much-needed calories. Imagine being trapped in a smoky, turf-covered shed with 30 of your closest, smelliest relatives, eating leather fish and drinking warm beer for months on end. It's a wonder they didn't go on more raids just to get some fresh air.
The art of the woolen onion. So we've established that the longhouse was essentially a smoky, sod-covered communal tube shared with livestock. But once you eventually had to leave that biological space heater, the cow, to actually do something outside, the challenge changed from how do I breathe without coughing to how do I keep my blood from turning into slush. And this is where the Vikings became absolute masters of the onion method. Of course they did, because when your environment is trying to flash freeze your extremities, you don't just put on a coat, you become a walking layer cake of sheep products. Everything started with the sheep. The Icelandic sheep, specifically, were and still are these incredibly hardy little tanks of the animal kingdom. They have a dual-layered fleece, the tog, which is long and water-repellent, and the thell, which is soft and insulating. The Vikings didn't just shear these sheep, they practically lived off their output. If you were a Viking woman, your entire winter was defined by the rhythmic thrum-thrum of the loom. You were spinning, weaving, and sewing in the dim light of a flickering oil lamp fueled by seal blubber. Because why use wax when you can use the rendered fat of a sea mammal? It smelled like a fish market that had been left in the sun, but it kept the shadows at bay. The base layer was usually a linen shift, if you were fancy enough to afford imported flax. But for the average Bjorn or Astrid, it was all wool all the way down. It's scratchy, it's heavy, and when it gets wet, it gains about 20 pounds. But wool has this magical property where it still insulates even when damp. So you'd have your tunic, then maybe another tunic, and then the vodmal, that thick felted wool fabric I mentioned earlier. It was so dense that it was actually used as a form of currency. You could literally pay your taxes in pieces of your own clothes. Imagine walking into a government office today and handing over your sweater to settle your bill. It's practical, in a very itchy sort of way. Then we have the feet. If your feet went, you were done. They didn't have heavy leather boots with rubber soles. They had turn shoes, which were basically thin leather slippers made inside out and then flipped. They offered zero insulation. To fix this, they stuffed their shoes with dried grass or moss. It was like walking on a very small, very damp lawn. On top of that, they wore nail-bound socks, not knitted, but made with a single needle technique that creates a fabric that doesn't unravel. It's incredibly slow to make, which is perfect for those 4-month-long nights when you have nothing to do but stare at a goat and wonder if the sun is ever coming back. Let's float over to the concept of the Arctic winter blues, because the mental toll was just as heavy as the wool. In the deepest part of winter, in places like northern Norway, the sun doesn't just set, it goes on a sabbatical. You're living in a world of blue twilight and obsidian blackness. This is where the monotone part of Viking life really kicks in. When you can't see to work and it's too cold to play, you tell stories. But these weren't the high-octane Marvel versions of Thor. These were long, rambling, incredibly detailed sagas about who owned which cow in the year 900. They were the original sleep-inducing monologues. You'd sit in the dark, listening to an old man recount the genealogy of a family 3 fjords over, just to keep your brain from freezing solid. And then there was the hygiene, or the lack thereof. There's a persistent myth that Vikings were these exceptionally clean people because they had combs and ear spoons. And sure, compared to some of their European neighbors, they were practically spa-goers. But in the winter, you aren't stripping down for a refreshing dip in a frozen fjord unless you have a death wish. You stayed in those layers for weeks, maybe months. The Viking scent was a complex bouquet of wood smoke, old sweat, fermented fish, and the ever-present aroma of the barn.
It was a sensory experience that we, in our climate-controlled world, can't even begin to fathom. But there was a logic to the grime. Dirt and oils from the skin actually helped the wool stay water-resistant. You weren't dirty, you were properly seasoned for the environment. If you were too clean, you were cold. So the most successful Vikings were likely the ones who smelled the most like a campfire at a petting zoo. It's a bit of a tragedy, really. All that gold they raided from monasteries, and they couldn't even buy a decent bar of unscented soap or a pressurized shower.
The fermented buffet of survival. So, you're layered up in 3 sweaters, you've accepted that you smell like a wet dog that lives in a chimney, and you're tucked into your little wooden sleeping cupboard. But eventually, your stomach starts to protest. And in the Viking Age, your kitchen wasn't a room. It was a series of barrels, hanging racks, and pits in the ground. Because when the ground is frozen solid and nothing grows for 6 months, you stop being a cook and you start being a preservation specialist, which is just a fancy way of saying you're an expert at keeping things from rotting just long enough to eat them. Let's talk about the Viking diet, which was essentially a long-term commitment to vinegar, salt, and bacteria. The primary goal was to avoid scurvy, that delightful condition where your teeth fall out and your old scars start to reopen. To prevent this, they turned to the vitamin C of the north, the cloudberry and the crowberry. But since you can't pick berries in January, they stored them in wooden barrels filled with sour whey, a byproduct of cheese making. Imagine a bowl of tiny, tart berries that have been marinating in fermented milk liquid for 4 months. It's a texture that can only be described as challenging, but it kept your gums attached to your jaw, so you didn't complain. Then there was the fish. If you lived near the coast, which most of them did, fish was your lifeblood. But fresh fish was a luxury of the summer. For winter, you had stockfish. This was cod that had been hung out on wooden racks to dry in the cold Arctic wind until it was as hard as a piece of cedar siding. To eat it, you couldn't just cook it. You had to beat it with a hammer. Literally, you'd sit by the fire, rhythmically thumping a piece of dried fish against a stone until the fibers shattered enough that you could chew it without breaking a molar. It was a meal and a workout all in one, because why not add a little manual labor to your dinner routine? But we can't talk about Viking winter food without mentioning the legendary hakarl, or fermented shark. Now, Greenland shark is actually toxic if you eat it fresh. It's full of urea and trimethylamine oxide, which is basically nature's way of saying, please don't. But the Vikings, in their infinite why-not wisdom, figured out that if you bury the shark in a hole in the sand, let it ferment in its own fluids for a few months, and then hang it up to dry, it becomes edible. Edible is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. It smells like high-strength floor cleaner and tastes like a bad decision. But in the middle of a blizzard, when the pantry is looking thin, a piece of ammonia-scented shark starts to look like a 5-star steak. And let's float over to the dairy. Since the cows were living right there in the house with you, you had access to milk, but you couldn't keep it fresh. So they made skyr. It's often sold today as a trendy Icelandic yogurt, but the Viking version was more of a thick, sour curd that stayed stable for ages. They kept it in massive vats, and sometimes they'd drop entire sheep's heads or flippers into the whey to preserve them. It was like a very depressing, very cold treasure hunt. Oh, look, I found a trot ear. To wash all this down, they had ale, but not the crisp, cold lager you're thinking of. This was thick, room temperature, which remember was about 45 degrees, and often flavored with bog myrtle or juniper, because hops weren't a big thing yet. It was more like a liquid loaf of bread. And honestly, after a day of beating your dinner with a hammer and smelling your own woolen tunic, a couple of mugs of thick, herbal ale was probably the only thing keeping the social fabric of the longhouse together. It provided the calories, the hydration, and the necessary emotional buffer to deal with the fact that your brother-in-law has been telling the same story about a haunted rock for 3 weeks straight. It was a slow, repetitive, and deeply flavored existence. But it worked. They didn't just survive. They thrived in conditions that would make a modern human crumble.
They turned rot into recipes and smoke into a blanket. Ghosts, games, and the sky on fire. So, you've had your fill of hammer-beaten fish and ammonia-flavored shark, and you're settling back into the smoky dimness. But even with a stomach full of fermented curds, there's a problem. It's only 4 p.m., it's pitch black outside, and it will stay that way for another 15 hours. This is the part of the Viking winter where the walls start to feel a little too close, and the shadows in the corner start to look a little too much like something with teeth. To keep from losing their minds, the Vikings leaned heavily into board games. Their favorite was Hnefatafl, which is often called Viking chess, though it's much more stressful. It's an asymmetrical game where one player has a king in the center and the other player has an army trying to capture him. It was essentially a metaphor for their lives. You're stuck in the middle, surrounded by hostile forces like the cold, the dark, and the lack of vitamin C, and you're just trying to find a way to escape to the edge of the board. They would play this for hours by the flickering light of the hearth, the carved bone pieces clicking softly against the wood. It was a quiet, rhythmic way to pass the time, the medieval equivalent of scrolling through your phone, but with significantly more risk of starting a blood feud over a bad move. But eventually, you'd have to look up from the game, and that's when you'd notice the lights. If you step outside the longhouse into the crisp, -30-degree air, you might see the Nordarlis, the northern lights. Today, we take photos of them and put them on Instagram. For a Viking, they were complicated. Some thought they were the reflections of the shields of the Valkyries riding to Valhalla. Others thought they were the breath of the great world serpent. But there was always a lingering sense of unease. In a world where light usually meant fire and warmth, these cold, dancing green curtains were a reminder that the gods were doing something very strange and very large just above your head. Let's float over to the darker side of the winter imagination, the Draugr. The Vikings didn't really do friendly ghosts. If you died and weren't properly buried, or if you were just a particularly unpleasant person in life, you came back as a Draugr, a reanimated corpse with superhuman strength and the ability to grow to massive size. And winter was their prime time. Because the ground was too frozen to bury anyone properly, bodies were often kept in outbuildings until spring. This meant you were literally living next door to your deceased ancestors, just waiting for the thaw. It's no wonder their stories were full of undead neighbors knocking on the door or sitting on the roof. It wasn't just folklore. It was a psychological manifestation of being trapped in a dark, frozen landscape with the literal weight of your ancestry just a few feet away. To combat the winter creeps, they had Yule. Long before it was Christmas, Yule was a midwinter festival that lasted for weeks. It wasn't about peace on earth. It was about, please let the sun come back. They sacrificed animals, smeared the blood on the walls of the longhouse, because why not add a little more red to the decor, and drank truly staggering amounts of ale. It was a desperate, joyous, slightly terrifying party designed to remind the gods that humanity was still here, still drinking, and still very much hoping for a Tuesday that involved a sunrise. There's a beautiful, slow tragedy to it all. The Vikings were these fierce warriors of legend, yet most of their lives were spent in this quiet, smoky limbo. They were people who could navigate the Atlantic without a compass, but spent 4 months a year wondering if a ghost was going to sit on their roof. They were masters of the sea who spent their winters beating dried fish with stones. It's a reminder that history isn't just the big battles. It's the quiet, cold moments in between, the sound of a loom, the smell of wood smoke, and the long, slow wait for the first green bud of spring. The messy, muddy resurrection. So, the calendar, or the position of the stars, since paper calendars were a bit of a future luxury, finally ticks over. The air changes. It's no longer that dry, lung-stinging cold. It starts to feel heavy, damp. It's the great thaw. And while it sounds poetic, for a Viking, it was mostly just a logistical nightmare of mud and disappointment.
Because when several feet of snow and layers of frozen sod start to melt at the same time, your house stops being a cozy burrito and starts being a very soggy sponge. Imagine the transition. You've spent months in your smoky cupboard, and suddenly the roof starts to drip. Not just water, but soot water, a lovely oily black liquid that ruins everything it touches. The floor, which was frozen dirt, turns into a quagmire. This was the moment of the great airing out. Every single person in the village would haul their heavy, grease-caked woolens outside. The hillsides would be covered in drying cloaks and blankets, making the landscape look like a giant, colorful laundry basket. It was the first time in months that you could see the true color of your neighbor's tunic, which was usually a revelation. "Oh, Hrothgar, you were wearing blue? I thought you were just gray." Let's float over to the spring cleaning of the longhouse. This wasn't just dusting, it was an archaeological excavation. They would dig out the old matted floor rushes and the layers of accumulated winter stuff. You'd find lost aiming pieces, chicken bones, and things you'd rather not identify. But more importantly, the livestock moved out. The cows, the goats, and the sheep were led back to the pastures. The silence in the house must have been deafening. No more lowing, no more chewing, no more biological 400-watt heaters. For the first few nights of spring, the house actually felt colder because the animals were gone. It's a strange irony. You spend all winter complaining about the smell of a cow, and then you miss its warmth the second it leaves. Then came the social reshuffling. Winter was the great equalizer. Everyone was equally trapped and equally smoky. But spring was when the hierarchy came back to life. The jarls, the nobles, would start planning their voyages. The carls, the free farmers, would start eyeing their plows, and the thralls, the enslaved people, would begin the back-breaking work of repairing the stone walls that the frost had heaved apart. It was a time of intense, frantic energy. You had a very small window to get seeds in the ground before the next winter started thinking about coming back. And let's talk about the first fresh meal. After months of eating things that tasted like ammonia or leather, the first sprig of wild garlic or the first fresh egg from a hen was basically a religious experience. They would forage for scurvy grass and nettles, anything green to wake up their bodies. It's a bit pathetic, really, thinking of these terrifying Vikings crawling through the mud to find a handful of weeds, but that's the reality of Arctic survival. You aren't a conqueror until you've had your vitamins. The ships would be dragged down to the water, their hulls checked for cracks. The tar would be melted, adding a new, sharper scent to the spring air. This was the transition from the indoor Viking to the outdoor Viking. The stories changed from ghosts sitting on roofs to the promise of silver across the sea. But as they looked back at their sod houses, dripping and muddy in the spring sun, there was probably a small part of them that already missed the quiet, rhythmic boredom of the dark. Or maybe not. They probably just really, really wanted a bath.
The sunny sprints and the salt-cured cycle. So, the mud has finally dried, the ships have stopped leaking, and for a few glorious months the sun decides to actually stick around. In the Arctic, summer isn't just a season, it's a deadline. It's a frantic, sweaty sprint to prepare for the next 6 months of darkness. Because as every Viking knew, the moment the first leaf turned yellow, the smoky burrito lifestyle was calling them back. The main priority was fodder. If you wanted those 400-watt biological heaters, your cows, to survive the next winter, they needed to eat, and they couldn't graze through 3 feet of snow. This meant that the entire community spent the summer obsessed with grass. They mowed everything, hillsides, meadows, even the little patches of turf on their own roofs. They used these short, curved scythes that required you to stay hunched over all day, because why should the summer be any easier on your back than the winter? The hay was dried on long wooden racks, catching the salt spray from the sea. It's a very specific kind of Norse aesthetic. Beautiful green fjords draped in drying grass that smells like a mix of clover and old ocean. Let's float over to the summer Viking economy. This was the time for raiding, yes, but mostly for trading. While the younger men were off seeing the world, and by seeing, I mean taking, the rest of the village was busy producing things to swap. They were making soapstone pots, carving walrus ivory, and, most importantly, preparing salt fish. Salt was a luxury, often made by boiling seaweed or seawater over a massive fire. It was a tedious, smoky process that produced a tiny amount of gray, gritty salt. But that salt was gold. It was the difference between having a ham in December or having a hole in the ground where a ham used to be. The social life of the summer was the thing, the great outdoor assembly. This was where the Vikings did their best to be civilized, which usually involved a lot of shouting and complex legal arguments about who owned which sheep. It was the only time of year you'd see people from other fjords. You'd catch up on the gossip, arrange marriages, which were basically business mergers with more wool involved, and try to remember what people looked like when they weren't covered in soot. It was a brief window of society before the isolation of the Arctic ice closed the doors again. But even as they laughed and traded and argued under the midnight sun, there was an underlying tension. You could feel the light starting to tilt. The shadows would get a little longer each day. The first frost in late August wasn't just a weather event, it was a warning. It was the signal to start hauling the barrels of skier back into the cellar and checking the sod on the roof for leaks. The transition back to winter was much faster than the transition to spring. One day you're enjoying a fresh berry in the sun, and the next you're looking for your heaviest woolen socks and wondering where you put that hammer for the dried fish. It was a cycle of extreme exertion and extreme hibernation. A life lived in two completely different gears. And as the sun began to dip below the horizon for the last time in the year, the Vikings would gather their livestock, blow out the outdoor lanterns, and crawl back into that dark, smoky, familiar world. They were ready. They had the wool, they had the fermented shark, and they had a whole new set of stories to tell. And that, my friends, is how you survive the Arctic without a single fireplace. It's a story of grit, grease, and a very high tolerance for the smell of wet sheep. I hope this journey into the cold has helped you settle in for the night.
The silent siege of the soul. So the sun has dipped below the horizon for the final time this year. The sunny sprint is over, and the village has collectively retreated back into the earth. If part 1 was about the house and part 3 was about the food, part 7 is about the mind. Because surviving an Arctic winter isn't just a physical feat of wearing enough sweaters, it's a psychological siege. When you are trapped in a room with the same 20 people for 4 months, the monotone life becomes a very fragile thing. This is the time of the skoogie, the shadows. Not just the literal ones on the wall, but the mental ones. In the modern world, we call it seasonal affective disorder, but the Vikings just called it winter. There was a specific kind of quiet that would settle over the longhouse when the storm outside was so loud you couldn't even hear the cows mooing. You couldn't work, you couldn't hunt, and you certainly couldn't leave. You just had to exist. And in that existence, the smallest things became monumental. The way your uncle chewed his dried fish, the specific whistle of the wind through a gap in the sod, the fact that someone moved your favorite bone gaming piece. To cope with this, the Vikings developed a culture of extreme stoicism mixed with very long-winded poetry. If you were feeling winter mad, you didn't talk about your feelings, you composed a complex alliterative poem about a sword or a wave. It was a way of focusing the brain on something incredibly difficult and structured to keep it from spiraling into the dark. These poems, or drotkvat, were like linguistic puzzles. They were designed to be so complicated that they forced your mind to stay sharp, even when your body was sluggish and your blood felt like cold syrup. Let's float over to the concept of winter hospitality. Because travel was so dangerous, if someone actually did show up at your door in January, you had to let them in. It didn't matter if they were your mortal enemy. The law of the North dictated that you shared your smoky burrito with them. But imagine the tension. You're already low on ale, the shark is smelling particularly aggressive today, and now you have to host a guy who insulted your grandfather's cow back in July. You'd sit on opposite sides of the hearth, staring at each other through the peat smoke, being polite for 3 weeks because the snow was too deep for him to leave. It was a masterclass in passive aggression that would make a modern office environment look like a playground. And then there was the sensory deprivation. We forget how colorful our world is. For a Viking in winter, the world was 3 colors: black, white, and the flickering orange of the fire. That was it. Your eyes would literally ache for a different hue. This is why their jewelry was so bright. The gold and silver weren't just about wealth, they were about catching the light. They were tiny, shiny distractions from the overwhelming gray. When a woman wore her polished bronze brooches, they acted like little mirrors, bouncing the firelight around the dark room, creating tiny sparks of not darkness to keep the spirits up. As the winter reached its absolute nadir, the point where you've forgotten what grass feels like, and your skin has reached a permanent shade of soot pale, the stories would turn to the Ragnarok. They didn't just believe the world would end, they believed it would end with the Fimbulwinter, a 3-year-long winter with no summers in between. Every single year, as they sat in the dark, there was that tiny nagging thought, is this the one? Is the sun never coming back this time? But, as we saw in Part 5, the sun always did. And the fact that they went back into those holes in the ground year after year, knowing exactly how much it would smell and how much their teeth would ache from the stockfish, is the real Viking legend. It wasn't the axes, it was the patience, the sheer, stubborn, monotone patience to wait out the dark. And so, we leave the Vikings there, tucked into their wooden beds, wrapped in their oily wool, listening to the wind and the cows and the crackle of the peat. They've survived another Tuesday in February.
The architecture of the void. So, we've covered the clothes, the fermented shark, the livestock, and the psychological weight of the dark. But there is one final piece of the Viking winter puzzle that we haven't quite touched upon: the sheer physical silence of the landscape outside the longhouse walls. Because while the inside was a cacophony of snoring, chewing, and crackling peat, the outside was a void. And the Vikings had to build their entire lives to keep that void from breaking in. In the deepest part of winter, the snow wouldn't just sit on the ground, it would swallow the house. The sod walls would freeze into a solid block of ice and earth, essentially turning the longhouse into a man-made cave. This was actually a good thing. Snow is a surprisingly effective insulator. Once the drifts reached the eaves, the wind couldn't find the cracks in the timber anymore. The world became muffled. You wouldn't hear the sea anymore, even if you lived right on the fjord. You'd just hear the rhythmic thump of your own heart and the occasional groan of the wooden beams under the weight of the white desert above you. Let's float over to the winter chores that happened in this muffled world. You couldn't just sit still for 4 months, or your muscles would atrophy into useless strings. So the longhouse became a factory. Every piece of wood was carved, every tool was mended, and every scrap of leather was tanned. The men would sit by the fire, whittling intricate designs into the prows of boats that wouldn't see water for half a year. It was a form of manual meditation. If you've ever wondered why Viking art is so incredibly dense and complex, with all those intertwining snakes and knots, it's because they had a lot of time. A lot of time. If you're stuck in a hole for 150 days, you don't just carve a spoon. You carve a spoon that tells the entire history of the world. There was also the maintenance of the fire watch. The fire couldn't go out. If the hearth died in the middle of a blizzard, you weren't just cold, you were in a life-threatening crisis. Starting a fire with flint and steel in a damp, freezing room is an exercise in frustration that usually ends in tears. So there was always someone awake, a silent sentinel sitting in the dim orange glow, feeding the peat, watching the smoke drift toward the vindalga. It was a lonely, quiet job, usually reserved for the elderly or the very young. They were the keepers of the light, the only thing standing between the family and the absolute zero of the Arctic night. And as we wrap up this long, cold journey, think about the first time they finally opened the door, not in the great thaw of spring, but just for a moment in midwinter when the storm broke. The air that rushed in would have been so sharp, so clean, and so incredibly cold that it probably felt like a physical blow to the lungs. For a second, the smell of the cow and the smoked fish would vanish, replaced by the scent of nothingness. And then they'd pull the heavy wooden door shut, drop the iron bolt, and return to the huddle. The Vikings didn't beat the winter. They just made a deal with it. They agreed to live in the dirt and the smoke, and in exchange, the winter let them keep their lives until the sun decided to return. It's a quiet, humble kind of heroism. No axes, no dragons, just a lot of patience and a very thick blanket. And that truly is the end of our Arctic vigil. The fire is burning low, the longhouse is quiet, and the saga is finished. I hope you're feeling as cozy and insulated as a Viking in a sod house.
The ghostly architecture of the Arctic. So, the door is bolted, the snow has reached the roofline, and we've discussed the carving and the fire watch. But there is one final, almost invisible layer to this survival story: the architecture of the air itself. You see, when you're living in a sod-covered tube, the way air moves isn't just about comfort. It's a delicate, high-stakes science that the Vikings mastered by accident and observation. Because if the air stops moving, you suffocate on carbon monoxide. If it moves too much, you freeze. It was a constant, silent tug-of-war between the fire and the frost. The Vikings lived in what we might call a layered atmosphere. Because the smoke hole in the roof was always open, there was a constant stream of freezing air dropping down and a constant stream of hot, acrid smoke rising up. This created a comfort zone exactly between the heights of 2 and 4 feet off the ground. If you stood up quickly to stretch, your head would disappear into a thick gray cloud of peat smoke that would make your eyes sting and your throat seize. But if you sat on the low benches, which of course they did, the air was relatively clear. They spent an entire season living in a crouched, horizontal world. To be a Viking in winter was to be permanently low profile. Let's float over to the winter water problem. You might be surrounded by billions of tons of frozen water in the form of snow, but you can't drink snow. Well, you can, but it lowers your body temperature so rapidly that it's a dangerous game. You have to melt it. And melting snow takes a staggering amount of fuel. So every drop of liquid water in the longhouse was treated like liquid gold. This led to a level of reusing that would make a modern environmentalist wince. The water used to boil the meat became the base for the morning porridge, which became the wash water for the bowls, which eventually, well, let's just say nothing went to waste. This brings us to the Arctic thirst. Air is incredibly dry, and when you're breathing in peat smoke all day, your throat feels like it's been lined with sandpaper. This is why the ale and the sira, the fermented whey, weren't just for getting tipsy, they were a biological necessity. They lived in a state of mild, constant fermentation. Everyone, from the youngest child to the oldest grandmother, was perpetually just a little bit bright-eyed from the weak ale. It helped dull the ache of the cold, it provided the calories, and it made the 14th retelling of the same story about a haunted bog feel like a thrilling new epic. There's a strange beauty in the thought of these people, huddled in their smoke caves, lit by a single flickering flame, vibrating with the low-level energy of fermented grain. They were essentially hibernating while awake. Their heart rate slowed, their movements became deliberate and heavy, and their world shrank down to the reach of their own hands. They became part of the furniture, part of the sod, part of the very landscape they were trying to hide from. And as the final embers of our story glow in the dark, think of the resilience of the human spirit. We are a species that can take the most inhospitable, soul-crushing cold and turn it into a home. We can find rhythm in the silence and flavor in a piece of dried woodfish. The Vikings didn't just survive the Arctic, they made it theirs. They wove it into their sagas, carved it into their spoons, and wore it in the smell of their wool. And with that, we truly reach the end of the Longhouse. The smoke has cleared, the sun is just a memory, and it's time to close our eyes. I hope the cold of the north has made your own bed feel just a little bit warmer tonight.
The loom of the long night. So, the air has settled into its layers, the ale has provided its liquid warmth, and the Longhouse has become a sealed vessel against the void. But there is one final rhythmic sound that defined the Viking winter, a sound that served as the heartbeat of the home when everything else was frozen solid. It was the clack-clack thud of the warp-weighted loom, because while we think of Vikings as explorers, for about 4 months of the year, they were primarily a society of textile engineers trapped in a dark room. The loom was a massive, upright wooden frame, and it sat in the part of the Longhouse that caught whatever meager light filtered down from the smoke hole. It was weighed down by stones, often smooth, heavy river rocks, to keep the threads taut. If you were a woman in a Viking winter, you spent hundreds, if not thousands of hours standing before this loom. It was a slow, vertical dance. You would walk back and forth, passing the shuttle through the threads, then using a bone or wooden sword to beat the fabric upward. Clack, clack, thud. It was the metronome of survival. If the weaving stopped, the clothes didn't get made. If the clothes didn't get made, the village died in October. It was that simple. Let's float over to the social loom. Because the work was so repetitive and took so long, the loom became the communal water cooler of the Viking Age. While 1 or 2 people worked the threads, others would gather nearby to card the wool or spin it into yarn using drop spindles. This was where the real history was kept, not in books, but in the gossip, the songs, and the shared memories exchanged over the rhythmic thud of the weaving sword. They would talk about who was likely to marry whom once the ice broke, or they'd analyze the legal nuances of a land dispute from 3 summers ago. The fabric they were making wasn't just wool, it was the social fabric of the entire community, literally being knotted together in the dark. There is something incredibly soothing about the thought of that sound. In a world where a blizzard is howling outside, a sound that represents chaos and death, the clack-thud of the loom represented order, life, and the future. They were making the sails for the ships that would sail to Byzantium. They were making the swaddling clothes for the babies who would be born in the spring. Every movement of the hand was an act of defiance against the Arctic winter. They were weaving their way back to the sun, 1 inch of wool at a time. And as the night grows truly deep, and the fire in our own minds begins to fade to embers, we can almost hear that distant, rhythmic thumping. It's a reminder that no matter how cold the world gets, or how long the dark lasts, there is always work to be done, stories to be told, and a thread to be followed. The Vikings knew that the winter wasn't an ending, it was just a very long, very quiet bridge to the next beginning. We've traveled far tonight, from the sod walls and the smoky ceilings to the fermented shark and the ghostly draug. We've seen how these people turned a frozen wasteland into a home through sheer, stubborn persistence and a lot of heavy knitwear. They've earned their rest, and honestly, so have you.
The geometry of the hearth. So,
The loom has finally gone silent for the night, and the last of the social energy has drifted up through the smoke hole. But as you lie there in your shut bed, your eyes might catch the final, glowing geometry of the hearth itself. We've called it a pit, but for a Viking, the hearth was the literal and spiritual anchor of their entire universe. It wasn't just where you cooked, it was the high seat of the fire. And the way they managed those dying embers was the difference between waking up to a warm room or waking up to a layer of frost on your eyebrows. In the middle of the night, someone, usually the oldest person who slept the lightest, would perform the raking of the coals. You don't just let a fire burn out, you bank it. You cover the glowing embers with a thick layer of ash, essentially putting the fire into a state of suspended animation. It's a very slow, very delicate process. You're trapping the heat inside a gray, powdery blanket so that in the morning you can just blow on it and bring the world back to life. It's a beautiful metaphor for the Viking winter itself, a period of intense heat and life hidden under a cold gray surface. Let's float over to the spiritual heat of the home. The Vikings believed in the landwater, the spirits of the land. They believed that the house itself had a soul, and that soul lived in the hearth. If the fire went out, the soul of the house left, and that was when the Draug or the frost giants could find a way in. So the hearth was never truly empty. Even when it was just a pile of gray ash, it was the most important person in the room. They would sometimes offer a little bit of ale or a scrap of food to the fire, a tiny bribe to keep the warmth from abandoning them. Because in the Arctic, the fire is the only god that actually answers your prayers in real time. And then there's the silence of the snow depth. By the middle of February, the snow isn't just a covering, it's a structural element. The weight of the snow on the roof actually seals the thatch and the sod, pressing the house together. It's as if the winter is giving the longhouse a giant icy hug. Inside, the air becomes incredibly still. You can hear the wood of the beams talking, creaking, and groaning as the temperature fluctuates. To a Viking, these weren't just house noises, they were the sounds of the building breathing. You lived inside a living thing. There's a profound sense of safety in that stillness. When you know there is 6 feet of frozen water between you and the wind, and you have your banked coals and your woolen blankets, the monotone life feels like a victory. You aren't just surviving, you are winning a very slow, very quiet war against the elements. You are a small, warm spark in a vast, cold universe, and for tonight, that is enough. As the last coal in the hearth settles and the ash turns completely gray, we can finally let go of the day. The Vikings are asleep, the cows are silent, and the Arctic wind is just a distant whisper against the sod. The world is on pause, waiting for the light to return. The saga of the winter survival is complete. The longhouse is dark, and the story has reached its quietest point. The fragile geometry of spring's first ghost. So the coals have been banked. The house has breathed its last wooden sigh for the night, and we've reached that strange, liminal space, the final few weeks of the long dark. This is the time when the Vikings began to look for the signs, not the big ones like the sun appearing, but the tiny, microscopic shifts in the environment. Because surviving the Arctic winter isn't just about the physical endurance of the cold, it's about the mental endurance of the weight. Let's float over to the concept of ice memory. In the final stretch of winter, the Vikings would perform a sort of inventory of their souls. They had been inside for so long that their memories of the green world started to feel like fiction. Did trees really have leaves? Was the ocean actually liquid? They would sit in the dim light and describe the summer to their children, not as a season, but as a myth. The grass is like the wool of the earth, they might say. They had to keep the idea of outside alive, or else the longhouse would become a tomb rather than a shelter. This was also the peak season for the vulva,
the seeress. If a village was lucky enough to have one, she would be the busiest person in February. People didn't want to know about great wars or gold. They wanted to know if the ice on the fjord was thinning. They wanted to know if the seals were moving under the pack ice. The Volva would sit by the hearth, her staff in hand, and chant her way into a trance. The sound of her voice, low, rhythmic, and monotone, would blend with the crackle of the peat. It was a spiritual weather report, a way to bridge the gap between the desperate humans in the dirt and the cold, indifferent gods in the sky. And then there was the light watch. At a certain point in late February or early March, the vindauga, the wind eye in the roof, would change. For months it had been a square of pitch black or deep bruised purple. But one morning, the light that falls through it isn't just less dark, it's a sharp, piercing needle of actual blue. It hits the soot-stained wall of the longhouse, and for a few minutes there is a literal finger of God pointing at the floor. The first person to see it wouldn't shout, they would just stop. They would stand in that tiny square of light, feeling the absolute, infinitesimal warmth of it on their skin. It was the signal. The siege was lifting. It's a quiet, slow-motion climax. There are no trumpets, no dramatic music, just a beam of light hitting a pile of sheepskins and a group of people who have forgotten what a shadow looks like when it's sharp. They would begin to prepare. They would check the leather of their sandals, sharpen the iron of their plows, and, perhaps most importantly, they would start to talk in a different tone. The winter voice, that low, hushed whisper of the longhouse, would slowly give way to the spring voice. It was louder, faster, and full of the frantic energy of people who have been held underwater for half a year and are finally reaching the surface. And so we leave the longhouse for the final time. The door is being unbolted, the snow is starting to weep into the soil, and the Vikings are stepping out into a world that is still cold, still dangerous, but finally, mercifully, bright. They have survived. They have kept the fire, they have woven the wool, and they have told the stories. Our journey through the Viking winter has reached its natural conclusion. The sun is up, the ice is breaking, and the saga is still.
The echo of the ancestors. So the needle of blue light has pierced the smoke, and the spring voice is beginning to hum through the timber walls. But before the door finally swings wide and the mud of the new year takes over, there is one last thing to consider: the weight of the ancestors who did this all before you. Because in a Viking longhouse, you weren't just living with your immediate family and a very warm cow. You were living inside a genealogy. Every beam in that house had been touched by a father, a grandfather, or a great-grandfather who had survived these same dark Tuesdays. In the final, slowest days of winter, the Vikings would often perform what we might call the counting of the names. Sitting by that banked hearth, the head of the household would recite the lineage. This wasn't just pride, it was a survival manual. Your great-grandfather survived the winter of the great frost by eating only the lichen from the stones, they might say. Your aunt kept the fire alive for 40 days of blizzard without a single fresh log. By speaking these names into the smoke, they were reminding themselves that they were made of the same stubborn stuff as the people who came before. It was a verbal anchor, keeping them from drifting away into the winter madness. Let's float over to the physical manifestation of this history, the high seat pillars.
These were the two massive wooden posts that flanked the seat of the head of the house. They were often carved with the images of gods like Odin or Thor, but also with the deeds of the family. During the winter, these pillars were more than just structural support for the roof. They were the guardians of the family's luck, or hamingja. If the pillars stayed dry and the carvings stayed sharp, the family was safe. You'd see children tracing the grooves of the carvings with their fingers in the dark, learning the shapes of their history before they even knew how to read the world outside. And then there's the final gift of the winter, the perspective. When you spend 4 months in a dark, smoky hole, your relationship with the world changes. You realize that luxury isn't gold or silk. Luxury is a dry pair of socks. Luxury is the smell of a fresh breeze that doesn't carry the scent of a goat. The Vikings emerged from their winters with a profound, almost spiritual appreciation for the mundane. Every green leaf, every ripple in the water, every bird call was a miracle because they had spent so long in a world where those things didn't exist. It made them fierce, yes, but it also made them deeply, quietly grateful for the sun. As we finally pull back from the longhouse, watching the smoke drift one last time against the pale Arctic sky, we see the transition is complete. The cycle has turned. The Vikings didn't just survive the winter, they were forged by it. They were the children of the peat smoke and the wool, the descendants of the loom and the hearth. And as they step out into the mud of spring, they carry that stillness within them, even as they prepare to row across the world. The north is quiet. The fire is home. The story is at rest. And that, truly and finally, concludes our 1.5-hour journey into the icy, monotone world of the Viking winter. I hope the rhythm of the loom and the warmth of the hearth have followed you into a deep and peaceful sleep.
The final thaw and the memory of the dark. So, the names have been counted, the ancestors have been honored, and the spring voice has reached a crescendo. But there is one final, lingering sensation that stays with a Viking as they prepare to leave the longhouse for the season. It is the realization that while the ice outside is melting, a little piece of the winter stays inside of you. It's a certain internal chill, a psychological readiness that defines the Norse character. You don't just walk away from 4 months of darkness and forget it. You carry the lessons of the silence with you into the noise of the summer. This final phase of the winter is what we might call the inventory of the spirit. Before they would fully commit to the outdoors, the Vikings would perform one last check of their winter gear, but they did it with a strange, slow reverence. As they folded away the heaviest of the Vadmal cloaks and oiled the leather of their sea boots, they weren't just tidying up. They were putting away the armor that had saved their lives. There was a genuine, quiet respect for the objects that had stood between them and the void. The pot that held the stew, the needle that mended the wool, the stone that weighted the loom. These weren't just things, they were the silent companions of the long night. Let's float over to the very last chore of the winter, the cleaning of the hearthstone. Once the fire was finally allowed to go out, truly out, for the first time in months, the stone at the bottom of the pit would be scrubbed. For months it had been the hottest, most central point of their universe, buried under ash and embers. Seeing the bare stone again was a sign that the heart of the house was going into a summer slumber. It was a moment of profound transition. The heat was no longer concentrated in one pit in the floor. It was spreading out into the sky, into the soil, and into the sea.
And finally, we look at the children. The Viking children who were born or grew up in these longhouses didn't see the winter as a hardship. They saw it as the story time. To them, the longhouse wasn't a smoky prison. It was a fortress of imagination. They grew up hearing the pulse of the loom and the crackle of the peat, and it made them a people who were comfortable with the dark. It's why centuries later, their descendants still have a reputation for being stoic and calm. They are the people who know that no matter how long the night is, there is always a way to weave your way through it. As we pull our focus back, further and further, the longhouse becomes just a small green-brown bump on the vast white and blue landscape of the north. The smoke has stopped, the doors are open, and the people are moving like tiny ants toward the water. The Arctic winter hasn't been defeated, it has simply stepped back to catch its breath. And the Vikings, with their soot-stained hands and their wool-heavy hearts, are ready for the sun. The saga is silent. The journey is done. The North remembers, and now, so do you.